inbox to put your summaries, and we want them by the end of the class period today, so don't forget to turn your summaries in. The ones that are graded are up here on the stage, roughly organized by alphabet. And just a couple comments about those first. There's a lot of check minuses. We're paying a lot of attention to grammar and sentence structure, paragraph structure, whether you follow the directions or not. So there's room for improvement. We'll give you a couple of passes on the check minuses, but if we don't start seeing improvement by third or fourth summary, then you need to be paying a little bit more attention, maybe coming to see Anna Rose or me about how to write a better summary, because that is one of the goals of this class, to get you to be better writers. Most of you are doing some really nice stuff with introductions and conclusions and bringing in some interesting perspectives of your own. So the gold star this week goes to you, Giancarlo. You're going to, yours, I would like you to edit it a little bit and send it back to me, and we'll send it to Digital Commons, and it will go up to be viewed by the world. All right?
Thank you.
So there'll be opportunities for the rest of you to do that as well. Okay. Also, there is a speaker coming to campus next Monday, March 7th, and her name is Catherine Kubalanka, and she's going to be speaking about Undoing Gender, stories from the Trans Kids Project. So if you want to get extra credit, you can come and attend that lecture. It's Monday, 7 o'clock in the Memorial Union Ballroom. I'll send out another little announcement on Sakai about that. But it's definitely covering the topics that we're looking at in this class. It'll be a good thing to see what she has to say, and I bet there'll be some clothing items in there because it's all about identity. Okay, so today we have with us Raul Cornier, who is a graduate student in our program, just about to finish. The only thing that's left is that pesky thesis. He is currently at Framingham State University in an administrative position, but before he had graduated from UMass Lowell with a BS in Business Administration, and for 8 years he worked at the Harvard Art Museums as an HR assistant. Then at that same time he did a graduate certificate in management, and is now, after doing coursework at URI, he is what we call ABT, all but thesis, and working at Framingham State. He also collects vintage fashion and is really knowledgeable about 20th century fashion, so we share a lot of stories about his finds. So, you'll be speaking today on gay dress and sexual identity in the 20th century. So let's welcome Raul.
So I'm going to use this microphone as I'm really soft-spoken. Thank you, Dr. Walters, for that introduction. I should probably also explain what the jump from management and business was to historic textiles, and it was that after this kind of long career in HR, I decided that I wanted to kind of follow my passion kind of thing, and I connected with someone who had been through the program, and so that's what got me interested in the program. I'd always admired fashion from a design perspective, but I didn't think I was creative enough to design. So the next best thing for me was to study it. Anyway, so coming here, my interests were in 20th and 21st century fashions and fashion identity and how people dress to communicate who they are as people. And also fashion subcultures. As Dr. Welter said, I'm currently working on my thesis. My thesis actually has to do with a part of gay subculture. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll talk a little bit about that in this presentation. So what is gay dress? When you think of gay dress, it's not really just a gay person in a dress. It's kind of an overall term to communicate the sartorial expressions of the LGBT community. Focus of this presentation, though, is going to be particularly on gay male dress and identity, and how and masculinity in the gay community. Certain forms of dress became sartorial codes to communicate sexual orientation to each other. So, there was historically being gay was illegal, immoral, still is to some degree immoral, and people, in order to kind of exist or coexist, had to find ways to communicate with each other in a more covert way. So they adopted and appropriated certain forms of dress that existed at the time, but were then kind of recontextualized. And so that person who wore this particular thing wore it so that another person who was part of that sexual orientation would know what it is, and so they would be able to connect. And as a result of that, communities formed. Gay dress is not only about self-expression or self-identity, but also the identity formation of groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about those groups as well, both in just a general cultural context, but also in the context of sexual identity and how sexual orientation and sexuality is integrated into our identity. Gay dress evolved, to become this demonstration of pride. Before that, as I mentioned, it was more covert, it was secretive, and then eventually it became this demonstration, declaration of identity and pride, but it wasn't always like that. And the one thing that is, I wouldn't say unique, but is very particular to gay dress or gay identity, is that context is key. You'll see that in a lot of the things that gay men wore, gay and lesbians wore, you had to know the context of what it meant and the environment. So if you wore this particular thing, it wouldn't mean anything to anyone who didn't know about it, but to the person who did know about it, it meant something significant. So for all you who take fashion history classes, you'll see a timeline in your classes, and talk about certain historical events that relate and connect to fashion. I kind of did that here a little bit, and so that and also kind of like insert particular points where gay history, gets affected in some particular way. I should go back actually and say that this picture, this is a book. It's called Gay Semiotics, and it's by Hal Fisher, and it was one of the more important or more seminal books on gay dress. He was a photographer in the 1970s. He just went around San Francisco and just photographed gay men and kind of talked about what they were wearing and what their identity was. And through that, you could see the formulation of these kind of gay groups. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was this movement called the aesthetics movement, and it was all about beauty. And you hear about it in our history. It was basically this focus on beauty and craft and a rejection of industrialism. So the Industrial Revolution had happened right before that, and so this was a rejection of that. And part of what made it appealing to gay men in particular was that you were able to be responsive to beauty, and so sophistication and being connected with things of beauty allowed effeminate-facing gay men to kind of coexist and exist in the world and kind of be more acceptable, at least for the time. And so that kind of movement happens, and through the 1920s, and we see, in the 1920s we see fashion change. We see this response to modernity, and with that, particularly in women's fashions, that hemlines change, silhouettes change. Women start cutting their hair very short, and just like what the aesthetic movement did for kind of gay, effeminate men, the 1920s did for masculine-facing or masculine-identified lesbians who would, kind of feel more appropriate or be in a more acceptable, have a more acceptable appearance if they, having short hair or even dressing with men's clothes. One thing that we don't hear a lot about, or we do hear a lot about, is the Harlem Renaissance, and how predominantly white people in New York would go to Harlem and experience kind of black culture as it was there. And what you don't hear about is that in addition to the kind of like the music and the dancing and the entertainment that existed, part of that were drag balls where men, mostly gay men, would go and present their clothing, dress as women. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. So all the good times end, the stock market crashes, and all of a sudden these kinds of hedonistic ideas, this kind of, so these sensibilities kind of end, and then we see the golden age, the Great Depression. But through the Great Depression, we see Hollywood expand as an industry and as a field. And what happens, particularly with gay and lesbians, is that if you were an effeminate gay man, and the best thing for you to do was to have a career that was in the arts. And Hollywood provided that. So a lot of gay men went to Hollywood to become designers, hairdressers, makeup artists, and in that way you could coexist as best as you could. A lot of men didn't come out, but it was kind of like this obvious secret that because a lot of the gay men in those fields were effeminate. If you were not effeminate, if you were masculine, then you could pass and you could probably get married, have children, and never ever experience your true sexual orientation, maybe through some kind of chance. So in the 1940s, World War II happens, and we're aware of the Holocaust. We're aware of the Nazi regime capturing Jewish people, capturing a lot of different people, and homosexuals were included in that. And like many of the other people captured by the Nazi regime, they had to wear certain identifiers. And the identifier for gay men and lesbians was a pink triangle. Later on in the 80s, you'll see that the gay community kind of reclaims that and wears it as part of their kind of this response, to gay pride and identity. In the 1950s, you start to see youth culture, and I think you've all, again, learned about this. And one of the youth cultures that come up that becomes more mainstream is biker culture. And with biker culture, you have people who kind of were kind of more rebellious, reject these ideals of, just coming home from the war and reject the government and are involved in these kind of biker gangs. They have a particular look. The look was captured in this movie, The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando. I think we study that a lot in fashion history classes. It's always pointed out as like this movie that kind of starts that. And what happens is, in a parallel way with heterosexual biker culture, there is also an underground gay biker culture movement as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The picture of the woman at the top is Louise Brooks, and she was a big star in the 1920s. And she adopted this boyish look, which is called the garçon look, which consisted of the short hair and wearing menswear. And again, it was acceptable, it was fashionable. So you could be a heterosexual woman and dress this way, but you could also be a lesbian and dress this way and kind of be part of fashion. But before I get into the specific codes that gay men used in the 20th century, just a couple things about them. The codes were intended to communicate sexual orientation or sexuality. So you wore this thing to let another gay man know that you were gay. You weren't letting anyone else except that particular gay man or lesbians. It was covert, as I mentioned before. It was not a demonstration of gay pride. You could be arrested for being gay. You could be harassed for being gay. You could be beaten up, murdered. So it wasn't something that people were advertising openly. That doesn't happen until the later 20th century. these sartorial codes are usually made up of upperclassmen, so when you see what they are, it's kind of more sophisticated accessories or pieces of clothing. And going back as early as the aesthetic movement, even before that, this kind of coding happens. Working class men didn't have a particular kind of coding until later on, where masculine identity starts to kind of come to the forefront of gay identity. Working class men did find their way into these gay social circles, sometimes through prostitution, sometimes through their skill, and through people who they knew. And as I said, it expressed sophistication, elegance, and pedigree, and not so much masculinity, as it does in later decades. So I tried to group them chronologically, but there is overlap, and with the research that I did, it doesn't really dictate a particular code to a particular decade or timeline. So drag and cross-gender dressing, of course, is the least masculine of all these, but it's also the thing that happens the most. And I use the word drag to kind of be this overarching term to describe dressing outside of your gender. It's been happening for centuries. It happens in other cultures, typically for a particular purpose, like in theater, for example. Women weren't in theater, so men would play the parts of women. So that's kind of the more understandable or accepted context of drag or cross-gender dressing. But you'll see that effeminate gay men also did this, particularly because prior to the 20th century, sexuality was binary. You were either sexuality was tied to gender, and it was binary. You were male or you were female. If you were gay or homosexual, it was more of an inversion. So you were basically a man with a woman trapped inside your body, and vice versa. So that's how sexuality was understood in the before the 20th century. So gay men felt that they were women, and so there was a lot of feminine affectation, and drag kind of also encouraged that. There were secret societies of men who dressed up in drag, and it still continues to this day in different ways, and although it's more accepted now. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, flower boutonnieres were used to kind of communicate sexuality. A lot of these things were also used by people who had eccentric tastes. So if you were kind of a flashy dresser, you would dress this way, but you were a flashy dresser and you were gay. So that's how people basically got through wearing things like this and without kind of causing any major ruckuses or causing major controversy. The picture here is of Oscar Wilde, and he was a well-known, he was from the aesthetic movement, a well-known writer, poet, playwright, and he really used the way he dressed to kind of project his identity as an aesthetic, but also as someone who had sexual relationships with men. So one thing he would do was wear green, and in particular would wear green carnations, and it was known that that was his kind of signifier to people. So that's one example. Another example I found in my research was this fiction book called The Cult of the Purple Rose, and it's about a group of Harvard students who want to form an art appreciation club, and by forming this club, they decide to wear purple, and they decide to wear purple rose boutonnieres. And so, again, aestheticism gets tied to kind of sexuality, and this is kind of the accepted way to dress. As I mentioned, green was a color to wear I'm going to find a quote here. So green was a signifier in the early 20th century. In the book Gay New York, George Chaucy notes that green suits were the badge of open pansies, and gay men dominated the use. So people wore green, and if you wore green, it was as you were gay. Again, it was compared to the idea of a time where people, particularly men, wearing dark grays, brown, dark suits, to wear color, kind of made people think that you were flamboyant or eccentric, and so that kind of became integrated with this idea of sexuality. Red also is another color that gets used, and it gets used pretty early on, before the 20th century. There were individuals who wore kind of red scarves, and if you wore a red tie, in the early part of the 20th century, you could be communicating that you were gay, or at least, had this like eccentric taste. And this happens until World War II, and then I guess the mainstream kind of catches on. And so by that point, other things catch on. So suede shoes were another example in the 1930s. Another quote, gay men dominated the use of dark brown and gray suede shoes in the 1930s, indicating that they were gay. Pocket squares also, they'd been used for a while, but if you wore a pocket square with very loud or eccentric colors, textiles, then that could be a communicator as well. So here's the timeline. So I divided up the timeline, early 20th, late 20th. So we know in the 1960s that there is activism, there's civil unrest, this culture of social justice as it relates to ethnicity, race, gender, and also sexuality. In 1969, the Stonewall Inn was a gay a bar that one of many gay bars that were mafia controlled, and police would do raids every once in a while. And when you did a raid, you kind of just behaved like people would dance together. You couldn't even dance together. So police would raid, they'd stop doing what they were doing, kind of behave. Lots of police abuse. Finally, the patrons of the bar, who were predominantly gay men and transgender women of color, decided to fight back. And so that kind of becomes this turning point in gay history. There were riots before that were kind of lesser known, but this becomes a turning point in gay history where we start to recognize the social injustices that are happening and start to do something about it. It leads to a lot of gay pride marches. So the gay pride events that happen now were really, what the precursor to that were, they were really protest marches. And so people wore t-shirts that kind of reflect, and so t-shirt technology came in and you were able to basically print anything you wanted on a t-shirt, and so you get this whole culture of t-shirt wearing and people wearing their identity on their t-shirt, literally. In the 1980s, the AIDS crisis happens, and again, there's a response to that because the gay community believes that the government is targeting them. Lots of groups, particularly this group called ACT UP, was very vocal in the 1980s. They created this t-shirt, and this t-shirt has become a very kind of iconic t-shirt, and if you remember me speaking about the pink triangle from the Holocaust, this is what they were talking about. So they inverted the triangle and added this silence equals death. This particular image I actually got from the opening ceremony, the store. It looks like they're kind of reissuing the shirt. So it's interesting that it kind of came back and the message is still important. In the 1990s, sexuality was in the media, particularly gay and lesbian, the LGBT community. There were a lot of television shows. There seemed to be more social acceptance. A few events that happened in the 90s, the March on Washington for Gay Rights. I don't know if you guys all know Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which is this executive order that if you served in the military, you couldn't disclose your sexuality. At that time, part of that was in terms of fashion, there was a response to that. And so in the gay community, people were wearing a lot of uniform-inspired clothing. So a lot of gay men were like dressing with like camos, and it just happened to kind of coincide with fashion as well at that time. And then in 1998, Matthew Shepard was this like 21-year-old man who was brutally beaten in Laramie, Wyoming, and it became, that incident pressured government into promoting hate crime legislation. In the 2000s, we start to learn about intersectionality and what it means to be a particular gender identity, what it means to be a particular sexual orientation, your ethnicity, and how those all interplay with each other and how you communicate that. Early in the 2000s, there was this phenomenon called the metrosexual, which was the very kind of manicured straight man that was kind of influenced by gay male culture. And then eventually, to not too long ago, we learned about the lumbersexual, which is kind of the opposite of that. And I'll talk about how that's kind of what I believe influenced that. And then, I know I'm going into past the 20th century technically, but I think it's important to notice that. And now that we know in the 2010s, there's a lot of awareness in the transgender community and what gender nonconformity is and what gender identity and gender expression is. And that's also reflected in fashion. And I'll probably know that in 2015, marriage equality happened on my birthday. So here are some specific codes from the late 20th century. Again, I tried to make it chronological, but there is overlap. But before I do that, at this point, because of the sexual revolution and sexual liberation, there is a more overt expression of what you're wearing as it relates to your sexual orientation. So there's a deliberate expression of not only who you are as a gay man, but also your sexual availability. Like, we can do this now. Placement on the body becomes important of these items, and masculine presentation then becomes the ideal. Before that wasn't the case, and it could be because a masculine gay man could, again, hide his sexuality and not have to deal with it, at least publicly. But that begins to change. And again, context is key. What you're wearing, the environment you're wearing it, who you're wearing it for, is important. This is an image from that book, Gay Semiotics, and I think it really pretty much explains everything visually of all the particular sartorial codes of the late 20th century. So my sense is that during the biker culture, we get this phenomenon where men are putting their keys on their belt loops. So that starts to communicate sexual availability. People are also using bandanas, they call it a handkerchief here, and putting them in their back pocket. And that's also communicating your sexual orientation and your availability. You'll also notice that there is a left side and the right side, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that relates to your role in what you're doing sexually. And an earring. So I think this changes geographically. I remember being a kid and learning that if you were a male and you wore an earring on your right ear, then you were gay. But if you weren't on your left ear, you weren't. But here they're saying something different. In this particular case, in this image. So a male with an earring says something. What it says depends on, I guess, where you live or the time you're living. Later on in the 80s and 90s, you start to see, again, T-shirts being more expressive about your sexual identity or orientation, and also worn as a symbol of pride, or worn to openly express who you are. It happens with flags, jewelry, and in particular the rainbow flag, which you're probably all familiar with. It gets printed everywhere, and that becomes the way people identify they were gay, at least beginning in the 90s, in a more mainstream kind of way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hanky code, which is actually my research topic. I'm looking to explore the cultural impact of the hanky code. What brought me to write about that or to think about that was that the hanky code is probably the only gay sartorial code that's existed for at least 40 years. And it's still around, it's still in use. It's the only code that evolved from this kind of secretive, covert communicating to more open expression. And it also ties into an individual's sexual identity, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Basically what the hanky code is this system of of coding to communicate sexual availability. A color represents a specific fetish, or like behavior or desire. Your sexual role in the fetish depends on where the bandana is worn in your back pocket. A top is a left or dominant or aggressive. There are a lot of adjectives that are used to describe that. And then in the bottom pocket, you would be the passive, submissive participant in that particular role. The earlier codes that I've researched have about 13 to 15 fetishes. Those are from the mid-70s. I'm sure that even before that there were even less. There are hanky codes now that represent over 50 fetishes with 50 different colors. There are gradations, so the colors look really similar. And so, trying to be more inclusive as possible, I guess. And as I said, it started as a secret code and then eventually evolved to be like a more open expression of identity. So I created this timeline. I probably shouldn't have used these lines because these aren't actual specific actual dates where things happen. It's kind of more of a general sense of what happens. So in my research, the earliest I've encountered talk about the hanky code is in 1971, where this, I guess you can call it a gay novelty store called the Trading Post, were selling bandanas, and they were selling the actual code with them. So you can, it's like a decoder, I guess. So if you remember from your fashion history and retailing courses, there are always early adopters. So my sense is that it was happening definitely before 1970, sometime in the late 60s probably. In the mid-70s is when it reaches a particular height of popularity. I found this quote in my research that relates to that, if I can find it. So it was this West Coast gay magazine, and it said, it declared, those handkerchiefs tucked into back pockets have become the rage of 75. So for that to be happening at that time, for that observation to be made, it really must have been kind of significant. My sense is also that it was happening, it was bi-coastal, so I think it was, my sense is that it was happening also on the East Coast in New York and big cities as well. I guess the one kind of specific date that does occur is in 1978. The lesbian BDSM social group. BDSM stands for bondage, domination, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism. It's a social group that kind of adapts the existing male hanky code, which was, I guess it was exclusively used by gay men. And they recreate a lesbian hanky code, so they take some of the colors and they kind of reinterpret some of the colors. And they send out a newsletter and they send a little card, the little code, to their membership and saying, this is the lesbian hanky code. And then, so they, again, we had some early adopters who were probably using it before then. But at that time, it's the only kind of formalization of the hanky code that I've seen so far in my research. Again, in the 1980s, the AIDS crisis happens, and because of the way people were contracting HIV through unprotected sex, there was a backlash to kind of this culture of sexual availability and anonymous sex. So it kind of goes back underground. It doesn't stop use, but it goes back underground to the male BDSM community that happens to be using it in the first place. And it stays there for the most part through into the 90s, where the heterosexual, I guess the non-homosexual BDSM community starts to use it and integrate it into their sexual practices. There are also a surge of additional colors, and there's some colors that seem to specifically happen in the 90s that are colors that relate to fetishizing ethnicity, non-white ethnicity. So if you fetishized an Asian person or a black person, there was a hanky code color for that. There's also a hanky code color for safer sex. So the hanky code was also kind of responding to the crisis in the community and what was happening in the community. In terms of the 2000s, this continued use, it is predominantly used by the leather community. I'll call it the leather community. It's also an interchangeable word for the BDSM community. And what's also happened is, and this is what I'm interested in exploring, is that it starts to influence other forms of dress. So the colors that are used in the bandanas are going into t-shirts, are going into shoelaces. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So it's now starting to evolve again. So you may miss these appearances, you may not, but it does make appearances in pop culture every once in a while. And here are some that I've found that stuck out for me. The film Cruising was a film from 1980, directed by William Friedkin, starring Al Pacino, and it's about a New York undercover cop who is investigating these murders that were happening in gay leather bars. And so he has to adapt this look and this identity and kind of do this undercover investigating. It's kind of like a slasher movie. This particular scene is the scene where he goes to this store, like I was talked about earlier, the Trading Post, and looks at the bandanas and asks, what is this for? And so the salesperson starts to describe what they're for. And it's an interesting scene because it kind of introduces him to the world of leather dress, and he thinks that he's got it, and then he kind of fumbles through it, and it's kind of this scene where it's more complex than what he thinks. It's not just wearing something, it's kind of the intent, it's the context. So it's an interesting scene that's in there. I don't know if it's in the original novel. I'm going to see if I can find it, if that scene is in there. My sense is that it's not, but so it does appear. It appears in music. I don't know if you're familiar with Peaches, but she has a song called Hanky Coat. It's a B-side on a single. This picture is the back of the single, and she's flagging. That's the term to use when somebody wearing a hanky coat is called flagging. And she kind of goes through the colors and what they mean in her song. There's some other song by a group called Kids on TV. So it's happening, and it's also happening in art. This image is from our performance piece. Vincent Chevalier is the artist, and he tattooed himself with this kind of outline of a handkerchief, and then he colors it in based on whatever his fetish is for the night. And so it's a performative piece, and it also speaks to the performative aspect of wearing this bandana and the performative aspect of sex. And then in the Autumn-Winter collection of 2014, Versace introduces this line where the inspiration are bikers and cowboys. And so with some of these biker looks, you see them with handkerchiefs in their back pocket. I've been looking to see if she says anything specifically about the hanky coat in interviews. It's not the case. But one thing I did find during the collection, she does play You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, which is a song by Sylvester, who is an openly gay, transgender, I guess, performance or singer from the 1970s. So there is a connection to gay culture in this collection. So I was talking a little bit about the influences and how it evolves. So I mentioned flagging is the term that's used for hanky coat, the people who wear them in their back pocket. It is now being used in shoelaces, so you don't have to just wear the bandana. You can put shoelaces on, you can wear it in your shirt, you can wear it in other pieces of your clothing to express this same message. And so again, it becomes less of a secretive communication, but a more open communication of what your fetishes are. There are particular apparel companies that cater to that. So the companies that make leather pieces for leathermen and sell them online, and so you can get them with particular trim. The most popular trim I've seen so far are yellow, red, and blue. And you'll see, and so of course with social media, you'll see in particular gay social networking apps, People are also kind of dressing this way to communicate their identity, their sexual identity. And I'll talk a little bit more again about sexual identity in a bit. These two individuals I actually talked to, and they were okay with me using their image. But as you can see, one of them, his profile name says Gray Hanky, so he does. So he's flagging gray, and the other person is flagging yellow, is what it's called. There, you know, and in addition to the networking apps, you can go on BuzzFeed, you can go on Salon, and there will be a lot of articles and listicles about the hanky code now. There seems to be kind of an interest in it. A lot of them are more humorous or tend to be humor related, and they're funny. So because it's really kind of silly when you think about the many colors that exist in the different kind of gradations. If you're going to go to this dark bar, you can't tell the difference between like chartreuse and regular green, or light pale yellow and regular yellow. So there is this kind of sense of humor tied to it now more than there had been before. Transgender men or trans men have also adopted flagging. I found some. I've done some research and found a magazine dedicated to trans men where they were flagging, and they are flagging with a plaid hanky or handkerchief. So again, the cultural impact of the hanky code continues on. So switching a little bit back to kind of gay tribes or gay groups. So we have these sartorial codes where people identify. People use it in their identity expression. So what happens is the formation of groups evolve within the LGBT community. So it's kind of these like subgroups within a subgroup. Other components of one's identity also informs one's membership. So if you think about your taste in music, where you live, these all inform your identity. And so I've picked out a few of the more typical tribes to look at, mostly because they also have a lot to do with, what they wear has a lot to do with who they are, and it's very important. So dandy or fairy, dandy is kind of the term that was used pre-20th century to describe gay men. I can't recall if it's derogatory or not, it probably was. Pansy was derogatory. Later on in the 20th century, fairy became derogatory. So it's this archetype, or this person who is well-dressed, manicured, well-maintained, fashionable in the sense that they wore things very kind of pristinely. This tribe exists today, and there's a lot of individuals. This person right here, his name is Patrick McDonald. He's kind of like I guess a social figure in New York nightlife. Always existed, and one of the not as masculine archetypes that exist, but still important, I believe. Then we have what was known as the clone in the 1970s, which is basically your average, good-looking, all-American guy who was interested in nightlife. The term kind of became circuit boy afterwards, and this was a person who was very kind of shaven, didn't exactly particularly follow fashion for fashion's sake, but was with the times. You start to see presentation of masculinity, so there's not so much a rejection of femininity, like the dandy embraces femininity, the clone not so much. And this became the ideal in the gay community. You'll also see he's white, and that was also kind of one of the, that was another kind of the dominant culture aspects of this identity. So this is the Leatherman, or BDSM practitioner. It kind of, that culture kind of comes from biker culture, kind of intersects, where the key item of clothing is this biker jacket, but really it's what's most tied to this particular tribe is the sexuality tied to wearing leather. One thing I should say is historically this kind of subculture has been very exclusive, very protective of its subculture, to the point where it would exclude many other different people, in particular people who are not white, and that has changed since then. And even people who are feminine, who presented feminine, people who were into leather but were kind of shunned because of their mannerisms. The bear community starts in the mid to late 80s and becomes a rejection of the clone look or the clone culture. It's individually these big, burly hirsute men who reject fashion, reject the self-manicured look, and becomes its own subculture, and it starts to grow in popularity. They have kind of their own language. They call their partners husbears. A skinny, hairy person is an otter. And there's a lot of sense of humor attached to it too. And it becomes this kind of rejection of the clone identity. But what ends up happening is that this identity becomes fashionable, and we all kind of know that as the lumbersexual now. These two individuals specifically are fashion designers. Name is Costello Tagliopietra, and they're out of Brooklyn and have been showing a lot recently in Fashion Week and all that. But they make these really beautiful dresses. So again, there's an intersectionality between who you are and how you dress as a person and what you do as a profession. And then again, drag, always there, always present. What happens now is there's this sense of gender nonconformity, so it's really kind of redefining what gender is and how you express femininity and masculinity in drag. This person is, his name is Conchita Wurst, is his drag name, and he's actually a winner of some Eurovision talent contest. And I chose this image to kind of represent this because it kind of really pinpoints the two pieces that are not so much challenging each other, but really intersecting this idea of masculinity with keeping your beard, and femininity with everything else, with this kind of fashionable dress, fashionable hair. He looks like Kim Kardashian, right? With a beard. One tribe that I did want to point out specifically, which is kind of part of the drag culture, and I referenced it a little earlier on during the timeline, is the ball scene. And it's really specifically the drag ball culture. It starts, kind of during the Harlem Renaissance, happens in New York and in Paris. So during the Harlem Renaissance, when people were coming to Harlem to experience black culture, drag balls were part of that, and it doesn't get talked about a lot. They were masquerade balls. Gay, effeminate black men were able to kind of dress in these amazing gowns and just walk around and dance and sing. And of course, at the end of the 1920s, when the stock market crashes and the Great Depression happens, there's an end to that. And so with that comes, hostility to not only, the gay community, but the gay community of color. The ball scene still happens today, but it's evolved a little bit more. It's a kind of a competitive presentation, so it's actually a competition. They have categories that you compete for, and a lot of the categories are based on either what you look like or what you're dressing as at that moment, or dancing. And the style of dancing is voguing, and I think you've heard of that. It was very popular in the 1990s. But the categories, I wanted to bring attention to the categories because the categories try to replicate this kind of masculine and feminine archetypes. And it was always this, you were trying to always reach authenticity, to be as authentic as possible, and that also gets integrated into the language. So they talk about in their categories what a blank blank realness. So there are certain categories, and this particular movie, Paris is Burning, was filmed in the late 80s, released in the 1990, and it really kind of demonstrates all of that. It's a documentary about the ball culture. but you succeed or you win by showing how real or authentic you are in your presentation. Many of these individuals came from poor and broken homes. They formed groups together, they formed kind of communities together and families together. They replicated kind of that family system with a mother of a house. They called their families houses. There was a mother of the house. Later houses would appropriate designer names, so there was the House of Chanel, there was the House of Givenchy, there's the House of Saint Laurent. So we take these as their last names too, and so they kind of come up with these new identities, and their life, or a big part of their life, was competing in these balls, either dancing or doing runway. And there, again, the runway was about realness. So you had like Town and Country was just basically how rich you could look. Executive realness was, putting on a business suit and kind of presenting as a successful masculine businessman. All these archetypes that existed in the dominant gay community were kind of coming into the ball scene as well, and seeing itself, seeing this kind of idealized sense of masculinity. So I mentioned the movie, and of course Madonna made a lot of things in the 1990s popular. She made Vogue culture popular in the 1990s with this song. A couple other artists do that, take on Vogue culture as well, or take on Vogue dancers in their videos. Queen Latifah did a video in the 90s that had voguing dancers. So it's happening, but she's the one that kind of really brings it to the mainstream. So I talk about sexuality, sexual orientation, but what is sexual identity? So sexual identity is this kind of self-expression. It integrates your sexuality or your sexual orientation and your gender identity. So in a lot of the research I did, sexual identity is kind of used interchangeably with sexuality or sexual orientation, but it's actually different. I created this graphic, and I don't know if it's particularly the best representation of sexual identity, but I looked at Susan Kaiser's a graphic of identity and how different parts of you inform your identity. And it's really the same way with sexual identity. The main components of your sexual identity are your sexuality, your gender identity, and your sexual practices or your behaviors. So those three things are the major things that inform your sexual identity. But other things can inform your sexual identity as well. Your age can, your socioeconomic status, your race, and your identity. So like identity, sexual identity is formed through the intersectionality of these characteristics. And sexual practices and behaviors are private, so it really isn't something that is presented or done as well, done more openly, so until in private circles. So as a result, discussions about sexual identity can be met with stigmatization. And I'm going to talk about some archetypes similar to the gay tribes that I talked about earlier, but the difference here is that these archetypes are connected with a form of sexual identity where what they look like or what they wear kind of provokes sexual identity, provokes sexuality, provokes desire. So for people who've done marketing or retail or branding work, in mimetic theory, an image is connected to an idea to create a response. It's kind of the same situation for a sexual archetype. So in marketing, it's done to create this desire to buy, but in this kind of scenario, it's done to kind of sexually want. Archetypes of masculinity, which exist in the gay community, are intended to provoke these sexual desires through memes. So what you look like, how you talk, what you say, provokes these desires, and masculinity as an ideal is something you reach for and kind of then becomes integrated into what you respond to. Dress enhances and becomes important part of the meme, communicating a specific form of the masculine ideal, and as a result, a sexual desire. And this really speaks to like the hanky coat finishes that I was talking to earlier. So here are some archetypes that I picked out. There are a lot more, but I think these are the most common ones in a sexual gay subculture. So again, I mentioned the biker, the leather man. This particular image is by Robert Mapplethorpe, who was a well-known photographer, who was also a member of the BDSM community, so he photographed a lot of individuals. And his photographs are very provocative. And so, the leather man or the biker so the best way to describe it is that you have bikers and you have people who are into BDSM. And like the leather man kind of becomes an intersection of that. So not all bikers are into leather and domination, and not all BDSM people are bikers. But as I mentioned before, the wearing of leather is an important part of the person's identity, and it's an important part of the sexuality. People, engage in sexual activities wearing wearing leather. Uniforms, particular military and blue-collar uniforms, are also kind of provoke sexual desire in gay sexual culture, if you want to call it that. This picture looks like a porn image, it might be, but I didn't get it from porn, I swear. But it's this kind of idea of a masculine ideal, someone who's in control, someone who knows what they're doing, aggressive, and that becomes kind of the character traits that are desirable for these archetypes. So you'll see in the gay community, if there are theme parties, and a lot of these basically can be theme parties, they will be like a uniform theme party, and people dress up in uniform. Rubber latex is similar to, kind of spawned from the leather community, and it's basically wearing rubber or latex in a sexual context. So you wear it and participate sexually by wearing this, and this is the thing that turns you on. The pup culture is kind of newer, and it's not to be confused with furries or plushies. This is also an offshoot of like the leather community, where men take on behavioral characteristics of dogs and pups. Their partners are called trainers or owners, and they really literally act like dogs and walk around on all fours. They've become really crafty. A lot of people who do leather work will make these kind of custom masks, and they'll use boxing gloves as their paws. And so some parties include, and some of it's sexual and some of it's actually not sexual. There will be kind of puppy parties where they just play in a pen and just act like dogs. This athletic archetype has existed for a really long time. It's the jock, it's the kind of the athletic man as this masculine ideal. In terms of fetishizing, or in terms of the sexual kind of archetype, it's again the same kind of ideals of the same qualities of masculinity, athleticism. It's not only tied to what you're wearing, but your physical body. A lot of the typical pieces of clothing in this kind of archetype are jock straps, which are athletic supporters, and wrestling singlets. So in the image you'll see a guy wearing a jock strap. And the other thing with this is that you don't just have to buy a jock strap from your sporting goods store. There are actually companies who will make jock straps just for you to wear sexually. There's also a subculture of gay skinheads, and who really kind of relate to this look and are attracted by this look. And the look is pretty much this right here. It's the bleached jeans, the Dr. Martens, suspenders, and a polo shirt, typically a Fred Perry polo shirt, sometimes a bomber jacket, always a shaved head. Some skinheads, they do subscribe to neo-Nazi sentiment and ideas, and it's kind of interesting that you're gay but you're racist. It's kind of this odd kind of disconnect that I still can't understand, and I'm actually interested in exploring it more. and some aren't. But it's really more about this look and this identity that is very kind of desirable to certain people. This is less so here than in, it's less so here than in Europe. It's more prevalent in Europe. And here with the Doc Martens, you also have an opportunity to flag if you're interested in flagging a particular fetish. And business suit is kind of typical. The fantasy, again, this sense of masculinity, success, becomes this sexual attraction. The other thing about business suits that I've seen in the research is that it's this representation of cleanliness and pristineness that is going to get dirty. So there's this kind of desire to kind of deconstruct this person, this perfect person, in a business suit. And cowboys are probably the oldest archetype of these. They existed forever. But again, this a sense of masculinity, and with the cowboy, there's also probably more so with the cowboy than with others, this sense of authenticity, where the more realistic a cowboy is, the greater the sexual desire, the greater the sexual experience. So that's very connected to this sense of authenticity. If you're with a cowboy, if you like cowboys. So what's happening beyond 2000? So as I mentioned before, there's this intersection of identities. Who you are in terms of your ethnicity, your sexuality, your gender expression. All these kind of get mixed around and explored and get re-represented or represented in new ways. And it's being done in fashion a lot more now than ever. The concept of gender nonconformity is kind of one of the design groups that I'm really interested in is Hood by Air. And this is a picture of their Spring/Summer 16 collection where if you can see closely on the model's face, there is this iconographic word, and it says top. And so referencing back kind of the hanky code and gay sartorial codes to, placement on the body and how you're communicating potentially your sexual identity as well. This is kind of a reinterpretation of that. So again, it's kind of still relevant and makes your sexual identity part of your overall identity as an important part of it. Transgender community, again, gains more visibility and acceptance through popular culture as well. The new creative director for Gucci, Alessandro Michel, kind of resurges the look of the 1960s peacock with very feminine fabrics for menswear. So what ends up happening is that this androgyny that was always predominantly masculine facing, so when you think of androgyny, you think of like plain, like no makeup, softer colors, subtle colors. It starts to present more feminine now. So this, Gucci is probably one of the more popular or known houses to kind of reintroduce that or kind of re-explore that topic. And that's it. Thank you so much. Any questions?
What was the first slide from? The very, very, very first slide.
The image?
Yeah.
The image was, I should have explained that. The image is from a catalog. And it's a catalog for gay men. And it sold like a lot of novelties, but these novelties were meant to kind of communicate your sexuality. So if you'll see what it's selling hanky recorders, t-shirts, bumper stickers, so all these kind of things that communicate your gay identity or your sexual identity.
I learned something.